Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
A new study by Columbia University's Earth Institute has linked the brutal war in Syria to climate change. According to scientists, a drought from 2006 to 2011 likely provided a spark for the war, although they're careful not to say it caused the war. The drought was considered, quote, the worst ever recorded in the region, which destroyed agriculture in the breadbasket region of northern Syria, driving dispossessed farmers to cities where poverty, government mismanagement, and other factors created unrest that exploded in spring 2011. Meanwhile, a group in Syria considered by the U.S. to be the poster boy of rebel groups has just disbanded, calling into question Washington's strategy in the war against ISIS. The so-called Hazm movement has already received weapons, cash, and training from the U.S. before dissolving, but had recently complained of financial aid drying up. The U.S. announced yesterday in a major strategic shift that it would start backing Syrian rebel groups with air power once it had trained at least 15,000 fighters over 3 years. Bob, are you surprised by the climate change links to the Syria war? And do you think that the U.S.'s blundering is only likely to make things worse?
The U.S. blundering in the Middle East? Who could suggest such a thing? Of course, the key to a lot of things in the Middle East still is the United States adopting a sensible policy toward Iran, and Syria is no different. Until we do that, I think the U.S. will continue to blunder. The climate change aspect of this is very important. You know, for a long time, people have understood that if you root around in most revolutions, somewhere you find a bread riot, that food and the fundamental subsidies for food are often crucial. The climate change issue is not new. Christian Parenti's book, A Tropic of Chaos, has been making this claim now for several years. So all of this comes together, a history of U.S. Decision-making in the Middle East that's been horrendous, both for the people and the possibility of long-term peace, along now with the magnified problem of resource inequality and food distribution. It's a kind of witch's brew that we're seeing come to fruit in the Middle East.
And in Nigeria, where ongoing unrest has plagued that country, the Boko Haram militant group seems to be taking a page out of ISIS's book. A new video emerged this week that appears to be filmed by Boko Haram, showing black-clad fighters beheading 2 victims alongside a black flag. The video has many of the same hallmarks of the Islamic State's propaganda. Boko Haram has claimed responsibility for killing and kidnapping thousands of Nigerians. Militant groups, including Boko Haram, have also recently taken credit for organizing suicide bombings carried out by young girls and women. In fact, over the weekend, a teenage girl in the northeastern city of Bachi was reportedly beaten to death and her body set on fire after a crowd of people in a marketplace suspected she might be a suicide bomber. Reports suggest it is highly unlikely the girl was carrying explosives, but suspicions were raised when she was found to be carrying plastic bottles under her hijab. Bob, how seriously is Nigeria in trouble, and why is it not attracting as much attention from the West as Syria and Iraq?
Well, people who observe Nigeria often talk about the Nigeria on the brink thesis, which has been discussed now for the better part of 20 years. And, you know, grizzled old Africa hands will tell you that Nigeria is always on the brink, but it's stable. There are some things we should consider. One of is, of course, about 90% of the income of the Nigerian government comes from oil. Oil prices have dropped by half. That's a serious consideration. And the Nigerian government has never really faced an opposition like Boko Haram. It ratchets up the level of not only violence, but of a sort of inability of the government to even know how to respond. A House subcommittee had a hearing recently on this Nigeria on the brink. They're taking it seriously enough. I think that it's quite possible, predictions are impossible, but quite possible that we're going to see a shift, and Nigeria is no longer going to be able to stay together as a nation.
And finally, here in the United States, President Obama's task force on 21st century policing has concluded that independent prosecutors should be reviewing cases of fatal police shootings as one way to rebuild trust between law enforcement and communities. The task force, which was appointed in the wake of the Ferguson, Missouri shooting of Michael Brown, also recommended an end to racial profiling, more community policing, greater civilian oversight, greater diversity, and better training for officers on how to de-escalate tense situations. Meanwhile, Cleveland, Ohio's Mayor Frank Jackson has just apologized to the family of the late 12-year-old Tamir Rice for the city's report that concluded the police killing of Rice was his own fault. Jackson says he regrets the insensitive wording used in the controversial report. And Mexico's government has just asked the U.S. Justice Department to investigate the recent police killings of 3 Mexican nationals in separate incidents, the most recent of which was Ernesto Javier Diaz in Santa Ana, California. Bob, at first glance, do the recommendations by the president's task force seem adequate, and what's the likelihood they will be implemented?
Well, they're adequate. They, of course, are suggestions that have been on the table for 20, 30 years now. And if, in fact, in a good faith effort, all of those recommendations were put into place, it would take us a long way to correcting the fundamental problems with modern policing, especially in some of these urban areas. Of course, there's a deeper conversation about economic inequality and racism that needs to go forward. But I do think this is, if it's serious, a good start. But we have an impediment. We always have to remember one of the impediments is police unions, which tend to be a negative force when trying to create community policing and community oversight. So for those of us who consider ourselves progressive pro-union, this always creates a bit of a problem. So there's a reason to be hopeful. I think a lot of the public conversation about this is taking us in the right direction, but also remember some of those impediments are still there.
Bob Jensen, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.